So we talked about Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act's kind of similar policy, but applied to the water. Initially for point source pollution, meaning at a certain location like a factory. 87 started getting into more mobile forms of water pollution, things coming downstream or from emissions. You had Safe Drinking Water Act, where the EPA enforces drinking requirements in terms of what amount of contaminants are allowed. Failure, like the others, results in sanctions. How do you implement the environmental policy? Well, it's bureaucracy. Bureaucracy tends to be a four-letter word, but somebody's got to do it. If Congress passes it, there's got to be a bureaucracy composed of bureaucrats to implement the congressional policies, or if it's at the state level, state policies. One thing to remember, most bureaucrats are appointed, not elected, which will have some effect on their behavior. The success of a congressional or state legislative piece of legislation addressing the environment or any type of policy for that matter depends upon how good your bureaucracy is. So, because the bureaucracy are the individuals, especially at the lower levels, they're the street workers, they're the ones that are actually implementing it. They're listening to their bosses in middle management, who are listening to their bosses in upper management, who are getting directives from the head of the EPA. One thing to remember is that your street level bureaucrats or the head of the EPA or his or her middle managers may have different preferences on how to implement the law or how to interpret the law. They may not like the way the law was passed, and they may see to it that, I wouldn't necessarily call it sabotage, but they're not incentivized if they don't agree with the law to implement it to its fullest effect. This is known as a principal-agent problem in government. In your workplace, it's the same thing. It's boss-employee relations. Boss wants the employee to work. Employee has some incentive to shirk. Boss wants to make sure the employee does their job. So in the case of policy, the principal is going to be your legislative body, the Congress or state legislature. They need to ensure that the agent, the bureaucracy, implements the law as intended to their preferences. And again, bureaucrats may have different preferences than the legislature, especially if you have career bureaucrats who have been there for many years and have gone through different administrations. One thing to know is it's very difficult for a legislature to observe bureaucrats' behavior. Look how large the bureaucracy is, from the management all the way down to the street level workers. State legislature, and especially Congress, has a very hard time monitoring that behavior. But if bureaucracies are left to do whatever they want, well, they can have a big influence on how policy is implemented. So if you get a bunch of, if you're in the Obama administration and there's a Democratic Congress, a Democratic president, and they want environmental reform, but middle managers in the EPA who have been there for many years, maybe they were appointed in the Bush administration or even earlier, and street level workers or career bureaucrats, maybe they don't like the new policy, they may just sit around and be slow and collect a paycheck, and that's their way of preventing a policy that they don't agree with from actually being implemented. At a large scale, if you've got a lot of people in bureaucracy that don't like what they're being told to do, it can have vast effects. A policy will not be implemented according to the principal's desire. The two types of principal-agent problems are adverse selection and the moral hazard problem. Adverse selection comes from the point that the principal or the legislature has a very hard time monitoring their agents, the bureaucracy. And that creates incentives for bureaucrats to engage in behavior that could be against what Congress or the legislature passes if they are ideologically or operationally opposed to that. And because it's so difficult to monitor them, especially at the street level, well, they're like, I'm a career bureaucrat, probably not going to get caught, or I'm just going to be really, really slow. And it's very, very, very difficult to fire somebody once you get into the public sector. Document, document, document. I think the most pejorative examples you go to, I don't know if it's different in Texas, Indiana, it was the DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles, getting your license, and you just got somebody that's been there for 20 years, just slow, they don't care, boss don't care, yeah, nothing you can do, it's hard to fire them. The example of this occurred during the Reagan administration. Reagan wanted less environmental regulation, but the bureaucrats in the EPA at that time had been appointed in previous administrations, and most likely if you're in the EPA, to some extent you're probably pro-environment. Now if you're been appointed by a Republican, probably a little bit less pro-environment on average than if you're appointed by a Democrat. But Reagan had an issue where his bureaucrats were more pro-environment, were not happy with Reagan wanting less restrictions. And what happened was at some point, they just kind of implemented, they actually increased enforcement. They implemented regulations and laws the way they wanted to, even in the face of lower budgets. When Reagan started slashing the budgets, oddly enough, at one point, their enforcement's actually increased. That's clear adverse selection because their incentives are different than their principles, and it's hard to monitor them, and they're going to engage in behavior if they want to. So they were a thorn in the side for Reagan. The one way to solve this, to make sure that your agents are listening to the principal or your employees are listening to the boss, is you can do a screening process. So you can, the president's not going to screen it, but individuals in the administration can, and they will interview heads of departments, the Department of Defense, Army, Department, EPA administration, Environmental Protection Agency, the HUD, Housing and Urban Development. Those directors will be interviewed, and they'll probably continue to interview people below them. So that's kind of, you can interview people and screen them and kind of get a sense of what kind of employee they're going to be or what their ideology is and their commitment to the administration's goals. But, one, sometimes there's career bureaucrats that, once again, they've got a job. They're not going to be turned over with the administration. These are street-level bureaucrats. And also, people may lie. They can lie and say, oh, yeah, I'm not going to enforce the regulations to an extent. I'm going to slow the process, and then they're actually have the opposite opinion. And the other thing is the principals don't always hire all of them. This is getting at that street-level bureaucrats, the career bureaucrats that have been there for years. So you can interview and screen, but it's not a perfect method. The moral hazard principal agent problem is that agents may be incentivized not to do their work, mainly for ideological reasons. They don't agree with policy, so they're going to slow it down. So, for example, with the issue with Reagan, when he was cutting the budget, wanting less enforcement of regulations, the agents decided to do more enforcement. Generally speaking, the agents aren't the ones punished by the electorate because they're appointed. Who gets the punishment's the president. So if, say, Obama ran on a pro-environment, and we say we're going to clean up the air, we're going to clean up the water, we're going to do all these restrictions and enforcements, and his EPA didn't do their job to the extent, well, the public's just going to see he didn't come through on his campaign promise. It's not going to be the agent, it's not going to be the EPA agents that, at the street level or the middle level that are going to face the backlash. It's going to be Obama, and the electorate's going to punish him. So it's very, very much in the interest of the principal to make sure that the agents do their job. Some things, way to control the agents, ex post control. You can try to monitor your agents, wait for them to misbehave, hope that you catch it, and then punish. And if the punishment's harsh enough and the agent thinks that you're credible and will do it again, then maybe they won't do that. But the problem, how do you observe misbehaving, especially in a large bureaucracy? How can the head of the EPA monitor everybody under him or her? Other things is that some of the problems may be catastrophic, like the Gulf oil spill on the Panhandle, which they're still feeling the effects of. I think the oyster industry in the Gulf Coast has been decimated, not only by over-harvesting oysters, but there's been some problems from the oil spill, and there's been, what's it called? It's been so long since I lived there. Red tide problems that are killing. It's the algae that's killing the ecosystem there. So if you go to the Panhandle, apparently a lot of the places the oysters are shipped in from other states, from Texas. That was the area of Florida that Michael hit. So I'm sure they're being hit doubly hard. But the case of the BP oil spill, yeah, BP was punished when they paid, but it was too late. You had oil balls washing up on the beaches. You had millions of gallons of oil that had to be cleaned up and the ecosystem farmed. So there's a problem with waiting for something to happen to punish because something could be so bad. Or you can do kind of ex ante or before policies. You can try to provide incentives to get them to do their job, or carrots and sticks, or punishment. Or you can actually try to go in and control the standard operating procedures of bureaucracy and how their day-to-day operations are run, how their organizational structure is organized. I mean, most bureaucracies are what? Pyramidal. If there's a way that you can affect that, this is something you probably get in org theory. Where I had that class? Where's that now? Org theory with Boyer?
The different organizational structures, talk about the hierarchical structure,
yeah.
The grid structure.
Yeah. So you can go in and manipulate that to if you think that's a better way to control your employees. That's not my area. What other class do you have? This Boyer, right?
Yeah.
That's the org theory class, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And he hasn't covered that yet?
Yeah, that was this week.
Oh, okay. There you go. Oh, yeah, the Rainey book. It's in there. That one's...
Either this week or last week. We talked about all the different types of structure and how you can modify it to decrease locus of control, increase locus of control.
Not my area of expertise, but that's a way to potentially control employees. Ask Dr. Boyer about that. So those are two principal agent problems, how to overcome them. There's an interesting academic study that says, forget all these ex post, ex ante controls, especially in terms of Congress and the federal bureaucracy. You should engage in what they call police patrols versus fire alarms. And the authors of the article, this was published probably 15, 20 years ago, argue for a fire alarm approach. So what we just mentioned, these ex ante controls, these ex post controls with monitoring the misbehaviors, somebody's got to do that. And that's a police patrol. It's like Congress going out, policing the bureaucracy, monitoring, calling in heads of departments for congressional hearings. But that's time consuming, it's difficult, it's not perfect. Members of Congress don't want to spend their time in hearings on how the EPA or Department of Interior is operating, or reading reports and listening to administrators. It's not electorally sexy for them to sit in Congress and do that. They'd much rather be making policy, meeting constituents, credit claiming. So that, according to the authors, I think it's Matt McCubbins is one of the authors. He was at UC San Diego. He argues these police patrol mechanisms aren't very effective. Congress should employ the fire alarm approach. And this is, let those interested in the policy area monitor the bureaucracy and let them pull the fire alarm when something's going wrong. So if the EPA is not doing its job, well, there's people out there like the Sierra Club, World Wildlife Fund, and other interest groups that care about the environment and that pay attention to what's going on. If there's a problem, let them sound the alarm and let them come to Congress or go to their member of Congress. Why should Congress do the monitoring? It's ineffective. It's a waste of time. Let the interest groups do it in our society. It's a pluralist society. There's people that join these groups, and that's their interest, is protecting the environment. Let them sound the alarm and then engage in some sort of action. He argues that that's a much more effective, much more efficient manner to do that. Questions on principal agent types of problems? Next slides are basically on the effectiveness of these acts. Generally speaking, I'm going to go over every point, they've been fairly effective, especially for stationary or source pollutants. So air pollution, we've seen decreases like in sulfur dioxide. We've seen decreases in the particulates that contribute to acid rain. Pollutants coming out of factories, there's been regulations on smokestacks and putting in scrubbers. has decreased certain types of pollution. But what's harder to monitor and to regulate are the emissions from your vehicles. And some emissions are not regulated yet. Carbon dioxide from producing electricity in transportation, and methane apparently is an environmental problem. I don't know the chemistry behind it and why it is, but your authors mentioned that these are some non-regulated issues that might come up in the future. So apparently methane, I think when plastic breaks down in landfills, it releases methane gas.
Yeah, it contributes to the greenhouse gas effect.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of the major ones that's causing the thermal energy to be contained within our atmosphere and see the increase in temperature.
All right. Yeah, there you go. This is interesting, enteric fermentation. I didn't realize. I thought that was a joke, but large cows, cow flatulence, cow gas, apparently big time beef industry and cattle. They produce a lot, and it contributes to it. So I don't know how you regulate that. And the lobby, I'm sure there'd be the beef industry and all the lobbyist groups, especially in Texas, would have a fit if that started being regulated.
There's already attempts. They're trying in California right now. They're limiting access to water to try to control the size of herds due to the effects on the Colorado River and the aquifers. Like there's a lot of political gamesmanship going on to try to get after climate change.
Oh my gosh. And the price of beef just keeps going right up. Yeah. I guess if you've ever driven through Texas, you see gigantic beef farm. You kind of feel bad for the animals because they're so packed in. But what can you do? Stop eating beef? I'm not willing to do that. Especially the beef down the road. If you guys been to Cattleman's? On Fabens? Very good beef. By the airport?
Oh, that's
This is land? Cattle land. Water pollution, generally speaking, for point pollution, like from factories, has declined, but non-point pollution has been tougher. This is what we talked about at the beginning of the lecture about fertilizers and waste leaching into the groundwater, into the rivers. It's really difficult to figure out which farm it comes from. And so trying to get at that's been very difficult. Drinking water, generally speaking, has been successful, but there are still some problems, especially with heavy metals, lead, arsenic, other chemicals some communities suffer from. More specifically, like Michigan, water came out yellow from lead, and gigantic government failure. You could probably consider that a focusing event, and any changes from that occurred. I've not followed it very closely, what's going on. I know there's been tons and tons of lawsuits, but what's that? Yeah. So, but when water comes out brown and the lead levels are through the roof, and it in theory should make some change.
In that region.
Yeah, because was the governor a Democrat at that time?
So like for the last 60 or 80 years, they've been a blue state.
Yeah.
And they thought the government would take care of them, and then all of a sudden people started getting all sorts of diseases.
Yeah. And Flint's not exactly the most politically powerful community. And, I think they switched source, and that was the cause of it. The pipes weren't very good. But yeah, I haven't followed too closely. But I guess it's not fixed. Basically, this slide just says it's very expensive. Billions and millions of dollars, federal, state, EPAs to engage in environmental regulation. And so that's why it can become very politically unpopular, especially if it's going to cost jobs in the economy. So at what point do we protect the environment, reduce pollution to get it, to improve the economy? What's the value of a job versus clean water, clean air, etc. The last bit of stuff is climate change, and it's fairly it's debated. The authors come down on the side that there's been tons of evidence that climate change occurs. Yes, some of it is cyclical, but for humans not to have some sort of impact, it's kind of hard to argue against, at least in my opinion, but some people still do. And what's going to happen if this continues and we don't change, then you're going to have oceans rising. I don't know if Miami, Florida will survive, New Orleans, West Coast. Miami probably not, but there's a lot of real estate that's very expensive and nice down there. And I'm not sure exactly how long it'll take, but there is evidence. There is global warming, climate change. The amount, I think, depending upon the amount, whether it's cyclical versus human-based, is debatable. But I think that, as you mentioned, it's most of the scientists say that we're contributing to it in some level. You just can't.
I kind of liken it this way: that if you had cancer and like 97% of the doctors said this is the cure, you would go with that cure.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And that's kind of my mindset to that. Is that if 97% of climate scientists are saying, hey, this is what we have to do, it's probably a good indication of what needs to be done.
Probably,
But
yeah.
that's the problem, is they can't agree on what needs to be done. They
That's
just keep
true.
saying something.
Something needs to be done.
And the most recent thing to come out of the biggest push, which I believe comes out of the UN, is we've got roughly 11 years to change course, or else we will be beyond
Yes.
the point of no return. But
They said that 10 years.
what's that?
They said that 10 years ago.
So we,
At some point, it's going to be true.
well, you know, broken clocks right twice a day. But you know, I think the big hang up right now for the governments that have to play a role in this is who pays. And it goes back to what we've basically been talking about. So like President Trump has been very us paying for everything. That's why there's so much contention with NATO, with UN, with every big agreement that we've been a part of. It feels like we've got a raw deal. When you look at it, China's economy is in some days much better shape than ours, some days much worse shape. But the U.S., the U.K., and one other country, they're responsible for, I think it's in here, they've got they're in the top 10 best economies, biggest economies, but we have a trending downward greenhouse gas emission. And then there's 3 other countries that are in the top 10 where their greenhouse gases are trending up, but they want us to put more of it.
China, India, maybe. Yeah, that's the other thing, is who's responsible, and how much is it our fault versus China's fault versus India's fault, and what protocols do we sign. But basically the idea is that they burn off these chemicals, they get released in the atmosphere, they get trapped, it creates kind of a blanket effect. And the idea is that it warms the atmosphere, melts the I suppose we're going to say glaciers, polar ice caps, sea levels rise, etc. It changes the ecosystem from all levels. Authors and studies indicate that it's human activity more so than cyclical patterns, and to what extent that is, I don't know. You have to ask the scientists in terms of the actual numbers and how long it'll take for it to occur. Kyoto Protocol, there's been some attempts to get agreements. U.S. never ratified it, and I think we recently stepped out of another protocol in the environment that nearly every country in Paris Accord, yeah, that was the one. And so we've stepped out of that. A lot of these protocols, the problem is that they're non-binding agreements, and so
Promise to do it in the future.
yeah, and then who's going to enforce that? It's
7 years from now, we'll be.
yeah, so it's a lot of talk, and probably the biggest changes won't occur until there's like a major event or major crisis. I know some people say these hurricanes have been a symptom of climate change. I'm not quite sure. I'm a climatologist, so just look at the general data to see the increase. I don't know if the hurricanes are the ones that's the biggest evidence. But I think the evidence is indicating that there is warming and there is a human impact. And you already got to, I think it's the last slide. Who should contribute? Who should pay? And I think that's the issue with even international relations, with NATO or other countries paying their due or not. And the politics behind this, as you saw with the video with Trump versus Clinton, it's controversial, especially in the Rust Belt, and Ohio, Pennsylvania, less so West Virginia, Michigan. Even though they've had declining electoral votes, they still have quite a few. And they're still very important to politicians, and to go in there and really attack industry is very difficult. So they have to walk a tight line. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in I think Manchin's going to win in West Virginia just because he's such a conservative Democrat. The Michigan races, I don't know if the governor's up in Michigan. I know Debbie Stabenow's up, but I think she's projected to win. I don't know about Kentucky, but there's some. Indiana's got Joe Donnelly up in Senate against a guy last name is Braun. That's another Rust Belt area. So it'd be interesting to see it. The polls are, as you mentioned, very close. Polls were wrong 2 years ago. It'd be interesting to see if they're wrong now. If people, apparently 2 years ago, I think it was people weren't truly revealing their preferences, and so they either didn't want to say they were going to vote for Trump, or they were scared or embarrassed to say it. And it ended up being that Trump won. So there was something wrong with the survey methodology. And I think most of the evidence pointed to people not being honest on in their polling. So whether or not we see that now, I still don't think Beto stands a snowball's chance to win. I still think he's going to lose by 4 or 5% at least.
That's still too close.
You think so?
That's still too close.
I don't think he's got. I don't.
I just want to eat.
Really?
Lose.
I think he's gonna lose by about 5 to 6. That's it. But that's
I think that's
Yeah.
the turnout, likely voters.
his. I mean, I don't like Ted Cruz at all, but Beto's campaign ads have been real not very good on TV. Cruz is really sticking it to him. Beto, I think, just now came out with the semi-negative ad. He's not been very negative on the campaign trail in these commercials. And then the commercials of him just speaking to the TV, they get kind of boring. I think the voters want to see those images of dogs and.
I think
Sure.
he's just following the Ocasio-Cortez model up there in New York.
Is
He's telling
kind-
them what they want
right
to
here?
hear and trying to get the turnout. And I think you're going to see some of the same political gamesmanship everywhere in this country, where they walk up to people, "Are you a registered voter? I'm not a citizen. That's okay. Let's work through it."
So you think it's going to be closer?
I do.
Really?
I think that seat will be decided by